Roland quickly gathered everyone together. The sudden news threw a wrench in his plans, forcing them to cut their offensive short. His first order was that all troops would begin withdrawing from the Holy City in phases. He announced that he'd be leaving ahead of schedule, aiming to get back to Neverwinter as fast as possible. The room's atmosphere grew tense. The captain asked, "What about the Kingdom of Dawn?" Andrea didn't say anything, but the anxiousness on her face was hard to miss. Roland looked at them both and assured Andrea that Neverwinter wouldn't abandon any ally. He promised to continue the plan to save Otto. And as for the King of Dawn, he and his men will pay the price. As Roland put it, Wimbledon's wrath may be slow, but it never misses its mark. He added that this wasn't something the First Army needed to worry about, he'd handle it after the meeting. When the meeting wrapped up, Roland asked Andrea to stay behind. He explained, the main force of the First Army has to head back and defend Neverwinter, so they'll need to tweak the plan a bit. But he tells her not to worry since he had convinced the Takira witches to take care of Ampion for them. Then he paused, knowing the next part was tricky. The problem now is how to maintain order in the Kingdom of Dawn. This leaves him no choice but to let the three noble families take charge. Andrea hesitated for a moment, then quickly pointed out that if that's the case it would mean Roland wouldn't gain much from this. Roland nodded, knowing she was right. He gets it, but right now, he'd rather not let Ampion turn against them. Besides, keeping Otto alive is his top priority. Just like he'd said before, Roland wasn't about to abandon anyone who had contributed to Grey Castle. Andrea froze for a moment, then visibly relaxed. A smile crept onto her face as she said, "Lady Edith was right, Roland truly is a merciful king." Curious, Roland wondered what Edith said. As it turned out, before they set out on this campaign, Edith had predicted that Roland would step in to help Otto. In fact, it was Edith who had convinced Andrea to make her decision so quickly. Without her, Andrea might not have acted as fast. Hearing this, Roland was a bit surprised but didn't dwell on it too much. After briefly discussing the next steps with her, he returned to his tent. Nightingale appeared behind him, having overheard the entire conversation. She frowned and asked, "What's that woman up to?" Roland realized she was talking about Edith. In his mind, it was probably just something they'd casually chatted about, considering they both attended the meeting back in Neverwinter. Just then, one of his guards lifted the tent flap and reported that Lady Edith was requesting to see him. Roland and Nightingale exchanged glances, neither of them was expecting this. Roland nodded and raised his teacup, while Nightingale eyed him with curiosity. When Edith entered the tent, she saluted before getting straight to the point. She wanted Roland to reconsider and abandon his interference in the Kingdom of Dawn. Roland frowned, telling her that if she had concerns, she should have brought them up during the meeting. Changing his decision now would make him look indecisive. But Edith argued that the plan could still move forward with some adjustments to the details. This way, it wouldn't seem like Roland was breaking his word, but rather that unforeseen circumstances had forced a change in plans. Nightingale couldn't hold back any longer and materialized beside Roland, her voice sharp as she questioned Edith. "What's her game here?" First, she convinced Andrea to ask His Majesty for help, and now she's saying they shouldn't interfere in Dawn's affairs. Edith didn't even blink, as if she had expected this reaction all along. Without a moment's hesitation, she explained, "It's because the situation has changed. Originally, Roland could have taken control of the Kingdom of Dawn completely. But now, at best, they can secure Andrea's family as a stable ally. In her opinion, it's better to let the Kingdom of Dawn descend into chaos. After the battle at Old Holy City, Ampion no longer has the strength or authority to govern the kingdom. She believes that the Kingdom of Dawn is on the verge of tearing itself apart." Roland didn't jump to any conclusions. Instead, he asked, "Why would a chaotic dawn be better?" Edith's answer was straightforward, saying because of the witches. Roland looked puzzled, so Edith elaborated. "The Kingdom of Dawn is in a better position than Grey Castle in many ways. Whether it's the demons invading Wolfheart and Eternal Winter or the Church's remnants trying to regroup, these threats will push witches southward. If the Kingdom of Dawn remains stable, they might not continue migrating to Grey Castle. It's very possible that in the future, Dawn could end up with more witches than Grey Castle. And that's not something she or anyone in Grey Castle wants to see." Nightingale was silent for a moment before she spoke up, saying, "Isn't it a good thing if everyone can live peacefully?" But Edith countered with a question of her own, asking her if she had ever considered what could happen if many witches awakened extraordinary abilities in Dawn. They could instantly change the balance between kingdoms. She took Anna, Agatha, and Soraya as examples. She claimed that so many witches in Neverwinter possess incredible powers. It's because of them that Neverwinter has pulled ahead of the other territories. Of course, Roland's leadership and his knowledge and vision are unmatched, but what about the future? No one lives forever, so 100 years from now, that knowledge would eventually spread beyond Neverwinter, and the witches from the Witches' Union would age and pass on. But what if the Kingdom of Dawn produced a witch who was irreplaceable? The table will turn, and then Grey Castle might find itself the one falling behind. Roland began clapping, clearly impressed. That's a brilliant deduction, he said, genuinely surprised by Edith's foresight. But despite her insight, he wasn't about to rescind the orders he'd already given. Edith, shocked, was about to argue further when Roland cut her off. He knows what she's going to say, perhaps along the lines of that a true king should prioritize the kingdom's interests above all else. But there's something she's missing. He paused briefly with a knowing smile on his face. He tells her this world has other kinds of rulers, maybe even a different type of governing system. Edith looked at him, clearly puzzled, unsure of what he meant. Roland chuckled. For instance, someone who's idealistic at heart. Time passed quickly, and soon it was evening. We find ourselves in a small, cozy room where Anna is sitting at a table, jotting down notes. Hearing a noise, she turns her head. Seeing it's Roland, she asks, finished with the meeting? Roland, looking a bit worn out, nods as he takes off his coat. Anna gets up, brings over a basin of water, and smiles, telling him to have a foot bath to relax, and then they can talk. She then kneels down to help him take off his shoes and socks. At first, Roland insists on doing it himself, but in the end, he doesn't even have the option to say no. Anna uses her ability to heat the water, and as the warmth surrounds his feet, Roland can't help but let out a long sigh of relief. Anna sits down beside him and asks if there's any good news from the meeting today. After all, ever since they received the letter from Neverwinter, Roland hadn't had a moment of real peace. Leaning back against Anna, he recounted everything that happened at the meeting today, and before they knew it, it was nighttime. After hearing the whole story, Anna smiled, but she didn't believe that the future would turn out the way Edith predicted. Roland looked at her curiously. Anna took a moment to gather her thoughts. She believes that once Roland defeats the church and wins the divine war, the witches will remember that. The Takira witches will take pride in him, and his name will be known everywhere, written in books and throughout history. Even in the future, Roland will be someone no one can forget. With that kind of reputation, the other lords will want to seek his protection, wanting to join under his rule. Perhaps by then, no one would dare go against his will. Even as time passes, maybe 100 years from now, this continent might only have one kingdom left, and humanity's territory will start expanding again, gradually restoring the glory of the human kingdoms thousands of years ago. Anna glanced at Roland, who had been quietly listening the whole time. She wondered if she said anything funny. Roland responded with a gentle tap on her forehead, smiling, saying that idea is exactly what he expected from her. Anna then got a bit confused. But if he didn't disagree with her, why had he seemed pleased with what Edith said? To Roland, what Edith said meant she had undergone a significant shift from being just a noble official to becoming a true politician. Anna had never heard the term before, so Roland explained, Edith's perspective and vision have already surpassed most people of this era. And there's something else, which is her understanding of witches. She recognizes that witches can bring about technological leaps and sees their abilities as a crucial part of a broader strategy. That alone puts her ahead of most. Anna suddenly asked, have Roland ever thought about the future? If they survived the Divine War, what did he want to do? Roland gazed into her eyes, smiled, and said, don't you already know? He had told her many times before, on many nights like this, his dreams of crossing the fertile plains, exploring the far region, and even venturing into the demon's territory, perhaps navigating the seas, spreading humanity's presence across distant shores. He wanted to unveil the mysteries of the so-called gods and uncovering the truth of this world. Once again, they made a promise to each other. No matter where the journey took them, even to the ends of the world, they would face it together. What happens next? Well, take a guess. Anyway, back in Neverwinter, Tilly stood watch over the giant magic stone, her eyes basically glued onto it. She couldn't shake the worry gnawing at her, but Pasha, standing behind her, tried to reassure her. As long as the magic stone isn't shattered, the witches are safe, Pasha said calmly. If they really run into demons, they'll crush the stones without hesitation. Tilly knew Pasha was right, but that didn't ease her mind. She had been watching over the stone for days, and the exhaustion was starting to catch up with her. Pasha gently urged her to take a break, promising to notify her if anything happened. Just then, Tilly felt a sharp sting. A tiny fragment of a magic stone had embedded itself in the skin of her hand, right where she wore her ring. Meanwhile, over at Ashes, before all this happened, precisely a day earlier, Lian was grumbling, saying it's been 5 days already, why haven't they seen any sign of the ruins? A blue-haired witch shrugged, saying, how should she know? This was our first time seeing her, and she had a unique ability to create invisible passages connecting two locations. She teased, just dig wherever Lian wants, and she and everyone else will follow. Hearing the word, Lian snapped, irritated. She asked if the girl thought she was a mole or something. The blue-haired girl just grinned, saying close enough. She then casually pulled out a piece of jerky, ignoring Lian's protests as she savored the snack. Ify sighed and warned her to ration her food, as she didn't want to be starving on the way back. The girl shot her a look, clearly not a fan of these blood-fawn witches, not to mention they even tried to kill Lady Tilly. She defiantly took another bite of jerky and said, if it were up to her, she wouldn't give them so much as a crumb. Ify didn't say anything, just watched her in silence. Ashes stood between them, feeling the tension. She turned to the girl and said, "It's not their fault they joined Bloodfang. And if Tilly hears her talking like this, she will be in for a scolding." The girl finally quieted down, though she still looked sullen. Ashes could only sigh inwardly. Another hothead. But what she's really concerned about is where exactly are they? She pulled out the map, but it was no use, they couldn't pinpoint their location. The map left by Lightning and Maisie was filled with strange markings like bird nests, beehives, and bear dens, none of which made any sense to them. Ify suddenly perked up, motioning for everyone to be quiet. They all listened closely and soon heard heavy footsteps above them. A group of demons was moving overhead. The group whispered among themselves, realizing it must be a patrol squad. The good news? It meant they were heading in the right direction. The bad news? They couldn't see outside, making it impossible to place the magic stones accurately or gauge how far they were from the Takira ruins. Ashes fell silent, thinking for a moment before deciding that she would fly up at night to take a look. But the others quickly voiced their concerns. Flying would make her an easy target. With nothing to hide behind, she'd be a sitting duck. Besides, Tilly had mentioned that Ashes could only control her flight path up and down. If she got spotted, escape would be nearly impossible. Tilly insisted once they were close enough, and all Ashes needed to do was get up there and crush the magic stone. Leon asked, "But what if a flying demon spots her?" Since Ashes won't be able to use her full strength in the air. Ashes smiled, saying she had a plan. The witches exchanged curious glances. Ashes continued, explaining that during her ascent, the only real threat would be the giant beast with demons on top. She had 3 different strategies in mind, so basically depending on whether she encountered 1, 2, or 3 beasts. If more than 3 showed up, she'd handle it as if there were only 3, ensuring she was prepared for anything. What the hell is she talking about? The witches stared at her, dumbfounded. Leon just buried her face in her hands, exasperated. Ify couldn't help but burst out laughing, and the girl which laughed so hard her stomach hurt, saying if she were Maisie, she'd totally be on board with that plan. Ashes watched them with a mix of amusement and annoyance, asking why don't they all hear her out before they start laughing? Though the girl couldn't resist teasing her, saying now she gets why Maisie always loved teaming up with her. In the end, Ashes managed to convince everyone to go along with her plan. As the sun began to set, the group prepared for action. A passage opened, and Ashes was teleported out. The others could only pray and hope this crazy plan would work. According to Ashes, if she encountered 1 demon, she'd capture it alive. If there were 2, she'd take them down. But if there were 3 or more, she'd retreat immediately. Leon figured they didn't have any better options, so they might as well go with it. Ashes channeled her magic into her ring and started to ascend. The night was pitch black, with only the moonlight to guide her. As she looked around, she realized there was no sign of any ruins. They were still surrounded by forest. Did they end up in the wrong place? Just as she was pondering their next move, she heard something nearby. She looked in that direction, but she didn't pay much attention. They had covered enough distance, but the small error had caused them to drift farther from their target. Before she could figure out her next step, the demons spotted her. A skeletal beast carrying several demons charged straight at her. Without hesitation, Ashes pulled out a magic stone and crushed it, then dove straight down. This was the worst-case scenario. There were way more than 3 demons. As she plummeted toward the ground, a tunnel appeared in front of her. She crossed her arms over her head, bracing for impact, but there was no way to slow down. Thankfully, Ify used her powers to bring Ashes to a safe stop, though she couldn't help but comment, "Wow, Ashes, you're heavier than you look." Ashes quickly told everyone to retreat toward the forest. She warned that the demons were coming. 3 days later, the group returned, however not looking in their greatest shape. Tilly was happy to see everyone safe but couldn't help but walk right up to Ashes, saying she couldn't believe someone who claims to be a wilderness expert couldn't even tell which way was north. She started teasing her as she wiped the dirt from Ash's face while asking how she even managed to find her way to Greycastle's royal capital back in the day. Ashes shrugged, recalling those days. Back then, there were always pursuers from the church. She just had to catch one and ask for directions. She tried to brush off their latest mishap, saying they weren't that far off. At least they spotted the Takira ruins. If the demons hadn't launched such a big attack, they would have noticed. Tilly paused for a moment before snapping, without enough red mist, they can't launch a large-scale attack. What they need to worry about is a sudden attack from the demons, and with Ash's strategy, they'd only catch a glimpse of their tails. Pasha spoke up, the fact that everyone made it back safely is what matters most. And honestly, this position isn't too bad. She went on to explain that Roland had already sent the first group of witches back yesterday, and Sylvie was among them. With her there, they could now handle early warnings and get a clear picture of the enemy's numbers. But for now, everyone should go get some rest. Tilly still looked upset and ordered Ashes to follow her. Suddenly, Pasha smiled at Ashes and said, "You know, Tilly was really worried about you." Tilly's face immediately flushed, and she quickened her pace, clearly embarrassed. Back in their quarters, Ashes hugged Tilly from behind. Tilly had a feeling she knew what was coming next, likely something Pasha had coached Ashes on, maybe along the lines of Tilly hasn't been resting well these past few days, or don't mind her attitude, she's just been worried sick. To Ash's surprise, Tilly had guessed it all correctly. Turning around, Tilly asked Ashes if she was going to apologize. But Ashes wasn't planning on it, saying she'd rather have Tilly not worry about her. More than anything, she doesn't want Tilly rushing into danger. Tilly was so frustrated that she nearly burst into tears, saying Ashes just don't get it, risks can be calculated, measured, and avoided. If it were her out there, it wouldn't have been nearly as dangerous. Ashes didn't argue, but she couldn't help thinking that Tilly was starting to sound a lot like Roland. Tilly snapped and told her to not change the subject. Ashes interrupted her, placing her hands on Tilly's shoulders. No matter what, unexpected things can happen. Even if the chances are slim, she'd rather take the risk herself. It's pretty simple. As the days went on, the more demons they fought out here, the more likely it was that she faced dangerous situations in the future. If something happens to her, she won't be around to apologize to Tilly. Tilly tried to cut her off, not wanting to hear anymore, but Ashes held her hand firmly, saying she's not like Roland. She can't plan out the future for humanity or chart the path for witches. But this is the one thing she knows she is doing right. If Tilly plans to go back to the slumbering isle, she can promise she won't have to worry about her. But here? She just can't make that promise. Ash's expression was so serious that Tilly didn't know how to respond. She awkwardly shifted the conversation, wanting to know what exactly happened, step by step. They need to figure out where things went wrong. But first, she added that Ashes better go take a bath first, she smells awful. Ashes poked her head out from behind the door and teasingly asked if Tilly wanted to join her. Tilly, thoroughly embarrassed, loudly refused. Tilly then looked at her hand. The wound from before had already healed. Thankfully, the worst-case scenario hadn't come to pass. Was she overthinking? Let's go and check on our wolf girl Lorca, who was still lying in bed. The pain seemed to have disappeared, though Lorca vaguely remembered what happened before she fell asleep. Manhwa had rushed in, and the first thing she did after arriving at Neverwinter was to treat her injuries. Lorca thought she should thank her properly when she got the chance. It was then that she noticed Roland standing by the bedside as well. "How are you feeling?" Lorca flexed her fingers a little, testing her body. She tells him the pain is gone. She thinks she is fine now. Roland took a few steps forward and, to her surprise, gently touched her ear. He rubbed it a bit and examined it closely. Lorca stared at him, utterly confused, as Roland withdrew his hand and said with a grin, saying he was just curious. He always wondered what they felt like, or if Lorca feels anything when being touched. Lorca couldn't quite figure out what was going on in Roland's mind. She wiggled her ear and replied, "They're just ears. If Roland is fine with it, she doesn't mind him touching it." Roland cleared his throat, suppressing a chuckle, saying he thinks that's enough for now. "Sure, buddy. Whatever you say." Lorca asked how long she had been asleep and where Manhwa was. Roland explained that she had been asleep for 3 days. If Nightfall hadn't deactivated the symbiosis seed, she probably would have slept even longer. Lorca got up, wanting to thank the 2 witches who had helped her. But before she can, Roland tells her that before that, he wants to thank Lorca on behalf of Neverwinter, and he wants to reward her. Hearing this, Lorca's ears twitched with excitement. Does this mean Roland acknowledges that she's capable of fighting demons? Roland sat on the edge of the bed and calmly said he never doubted her abilities. In fact, even an ordinary woman with no combat skills would contribute to this great war by helping in the rear. What he disagrees with is Lorca fighting them alone. One wrong move, and she might have ended up in a grave right now. Lorca, however, argued that if she hadn't acted the way she did, they wouldn't have discovered the demon army approaching Neverwinter. Roland shook his head. Lorca did the right thing by getting the message back, but she shouldn't have stayed to engage the enemy. He can reward a good outcome, but he can't condone reckless decisions just because they led to a relatively good outcome. The sudden shift in Roland's tone startled Lorca. Just a moment ago, he was teasing her about her ears, and now he was all serious. As for the reward, Roland offered her 3 choices: gold coins, chaos drinks, or a custom-made weapon. The first 2 were easy to understand, but it was the custom weapon that piqued her curiosity. Is it something for her wolf form? Maybe iron claws or steel fangs, she asked. Roland chuckled. Turned out, he hadn't figured out the specifics yet, but he was thinking of a firearm that would drastically boost her combat ability. Lorca thought for a moment. Deep down, she trusted her own body and fangs more than any external weapons. After a brief silence, she asked if she could join the Witch Union instead. Roland was taken aback for a second, and just as he was about to make a light-hearted comment about how she refused him before, Lorca blushed and said it's different now. She reasoned that gold coins would eventually run out, and chaos drinks would be gone in no time, but joining the Witch Union might be a better long-term choice. After all, as a member, she'd get a monthly allowance of gold coins and chaos drinks. The thought made her tail wagging excitedly. Seeing her tail wag, Roland almost lost control of his hand but managed to hold back the urge to reach out. He listened as Lorca continued, explaining that she'd already promised to explore the wilderness with Maisie and Lightning. Joining the Witch Union would make their adventures easier, and that's the reward she truly wanted. Roland smiled and asked her if she made up her mind. Lorca nodded, eager to sign the contract. Roland tells her there's no rush and Wendy will come by later to explain everything. For now, he will have the kitchen send some food over so she can rest. As for thanking Manhwa and the others, there will be plenty of chances. Noticing how weary Roland looked, Lorca realized that he must have come to see her as soon as he returned to Neverwinter. Watching him leave, her ears drooped slightly, and she sank back onto her pillow. Lost in thought, perhaps she should start trusting him a little more. After leaving Lorca's room, Roland made his way to the hall. The guards opened the door, and when everyone saw him, they immediately stood up. All of Neverwinter's top officials were gathered here. Roland took his seat at the head of the table and motioned for everyone to sit down. The purpose of this meeting was straightforward since Neverwinter couldn't allow the demons to establish a foothold on the fertile plains, especially not so close to their borders. The enemy arrived earlier than expected, but they're not too far behind, Roland said, scanning the room. He tells them Grey Castle is nearly unified, which means they can now focus all their efforts on the demons. Driving them out of the Takira ruins will be their next top priority. Yes, Your Majesty, the room responded in unison. Wendy was the first to speak up. She believed that the origins of the demons should be made public to the citizens sooner rather than later. If they don't get ahead of this, someone could use it against them later. Alethea nodded in agreement. Though she had little faith in the abilities of ordinary people, she acknowledged they were still important in the upcoming war. She believes that fear is like a whip. If wielded properly, it can drive people forward. Roland agreed and assigned Barif to handle the public announcement. He then turned his attention to Wade and the police department. As for anyone who tries to spread rumors or incite chaos, he probably doesn't need to tell them how to deal with these people. Hearing this, both men nodded. Pasha, curious about Roland's strategy for dealing with the demons near the Takira ruins, offered to send the Takira witches to the very front. Roland spread out a map and laid out his plan. The safest approach, he believed, was to set up artillery positions and destroy the demons' red mist supply from a distance. While they had enough long-range cannons, they weren't fully prepared. Without solid ground to stand on, it would be hard to hold their position under a demon assault. The first hurdle was solving the transportation problem. The scene shifted to the North Slope mine. A group followed closely behind Roland as he pulled the white sheet off something massive. Petrov's eyes widened in shock. Is that a steam-powered carriage? No, it's a train, Roland corrected, and explained it's a revolutionary form of transportation and the key to solving their logistics issue. Barif quickly caught on to Roland's idea. Believes that Roland is planning to build tracks across the plains, like here in Neverwinter. But he raised a concern. What if the demons attack the workers and disrupt the construction? Roland explained that there would be at least 2 tracks to ensure smooth back-and-forth transport. However, they are not going to cross the plains. They will start from the forest and build toward the area closest to the Takira ruins, then push east. That way, they will avoid the threat of demonic beasts since Leaf has full control over the forest. As for the demons, this is a battle between offense and defense. The tracks won't be built in just one place. Wherever the rails go, they will set up cannons. If they tear up the tracks under fire, they will just build faster than they can destroy. Just as Roland was delegating tasks, a high-pitched alarm rang out in the distance. Everyone froze, turning their eyes toward Roland. Urgently, they urged him to return to the castle for safety. Ashes drew her weapon and stood in front of Roland, ready to defend him. Where are the guards? Get the guards here and protect His Majesty. Barif shouted in a panic, as the officials surrounded Roland, shielding him. Tilly grabbed Roland's hand, squeezing it tightly, which surprised him. He knew Tilly didn't really see him as her real brother, but the moment danger struck, her first thought was still to protect him. This was a bit unexpected. But what was happening at the wall? The scene shifts to the city walls. Sylvie's eyes are fixed on the approaching threat, counting 6 demons riding giant beasts heading straight for them. They shouldn't be attacking, she thought. Aren't they supposed to be guarding the Stone of God punishment mines near the ruins, waiting for the Red Moon? Why would they strike first? The First Army quickly responded to the alarm. The wall captain shouted orders, telling everyone to prepare for battle. The wall cannons were already in position, and thanks to the telephones now installed, the officials on the wall received updates swiftly. She turned to Sylvie asking if the demons breach the city, can she guess which streets they'll hit? Sylvie did her best to stay calm. Predicted it could be 5th Street or 9th, maybe even the central square. However, there are still civilians there who haven't fully evacuated. The official repeated her assessment to the others, but Sylvie suddenly told her to wait. The demons were climbing higher. Are they trying to fly over the wall? Back at the city walls, they were already engaged in combat. Gunfire rang out, but hitting airborne targets was proving difficult, and the bullets weren't landing. Then, without warning, the demons stopped. Sylvie watched in horror as one of them raised its spear, its arm swelling grotesquely as it prepared to throw. "Get down," she shouted, but it was too late. The demon hurled the bone spear with terrifying force. It pierced the wall, injuring and killing several soldiers. Surprisingly, the demons didn't follow up with more attacks. Instead, they dropped something from the sky and turned to leave. What the demons had dropped turned out to be a series of disturbing images: a kneeling man, a tied-up woman, and a wolf. After receiving the news, Roland felt a mix of confusion and anger. Not only had the demons attacked and then casually flown off, but they'd left behind a taunting message as well. This was a blatant act of provocation. But Roland knew that the last thing they could afford right now was to act impulsively. He spread the images out, connecting them to form a message: a kneeling human, a tied-up witch, burning city walls, and scattered bones amid ruins. The message was clear: surrender the wolf girl, lay down their weapons, and live. If they resist, they will die. Pasha spoke up, saying this isn't just a threat but actually a trap. She'd heard of these tactics before. She urged Roland to not trust a word the demons say. Roland wondered if she had experienced this before. She went on to explain the history. During the First Divine War, the demons used similar methods to drive a wedge between mortals and witches, gradually eroding the strength of the Dawn region. In those days, ordinary humans and witches ruled side by side. Midway through the war, two major cities in the central region formed a coalition to fight the demons. The only difference between the two armies was that one was led by witches and the other entirely by ordinary humans. During a fierce battle, the human lord suddenly betrayed the witches, cutting them off during a retreat and using God's punishment stones against them. This betrayal later became known as the Twilight Schism, a bitter lesson that the Federation would never forget. From that day on, humanity gradually split into two distinct groups. However, this dark chapter wasn't recorded in history books but was passed down among the higher ranks of the Federation. Pasha believes that the demons' threats and divisive tactics may seem crude, but these are tactics they learned from them, the humans. Roland looked at Pasha in disbelief, while everyone else exchanged puzzled glances. The later part she said was for Roland to hear only, so the others couldn't hear. Pasha continued, explaining the rumors she had heard. Before the First Divine War, or perhaps even earlier, there were stories of humans making contact with the demons. Back then, the demons were no different from wild beasts. It was a human who taught them knowledge. Some believe this is why the higher-ranked demons gradually took on humanoid forms. But the top 3 seats dismissed this as nonsense and forbade any discussion of it among the populace. Only the upper-level witches ever heard these rumors. Roland remained silent for a moment before asking if she believed this rumor. Pasha said she wasn't sure. If it were true, it would only prove that trying to communicate with demons is a path to self-destruction. But Roland was curious. Do the rumors say whether this human was a witch or just a mortal? There are different versions, Pasha explained. Both have been passed down. If a kingdom ignored the demons' threats, they would continue their attacks until the ruler submitted. This method worked well against weaker towns. Roland smirked, so that means they'll be back. He called for Berev and instructed him to prepare compensation for the fallen soldiers. There's no better way to honor their fallen than with the blood of their enemies, he said. As for their trap, he will make sure the demons understand that this isn't the First Divine War anymore. As evening approached, Roland was still seated in his office, deep in thought. It was now clear to him that after Lorca fled back to Neverwinter, the demons had repeatedly scouted the western border. How else could they have known that this was primarily a human city and attempted to use the same threats they had used during the First Divine War? Yet neither the outposts nor the scouting god punishment witches had detected anything. If Sylvie hadn't taken over surveillance, the First Army might not have known about the enemy's approach until they were already at the walls. Roland angrily slammed his fist on the desk. This was proof enough that, with the current technology, the sky was Neverwinter's greatest weakness. Stepping out of his office, he decided it was time to visit the astrologer scholar. When Roland arrived at the mathematics department, the old scholar was delighted to see him again. He couldn't help but rave about the book on analytic geometry Roland had given him, calling it practically God's work. Roland was surprised to learn that the scholar had already mastered most of the content from the book. In the past 6 months, aside from the calculation tasks Roland had assigned, the scholars had been busy re-recording all the stars they had observed in the past, translating them into equations. In doing so, they established a celestial coordinate system and confirmed that the red moon had shown no signs of movement. With the war around the corner, when the red moon descends no longer mattered, thus Roland handed the scholar another task, emphasizing that it needed to be completed as soon as possible. However, this time it wasn't just about calculations. They would need to work with the First Army to solve a real-world problem. The scholar initially thought it might be something like the last time they worked on artillery firing tables, but Roland shook his head. It's more complicated than that, Roland explained. He needs a device that can predict the movement of a target. It has to be controlled by two interdependent equations, one describing horizontal displacement and the other describing vertical displacement. He then showed the scholar a rough sketch of the device, saying this is just a basic design idea. The exact parameters will need to be determined through testing.